Hi guys, this is Erin again, and I'm back with another PowerPoint lecture. Yay! This week we're talking about what you do with the research that you found over the last week or two. You've been filling out the matrix and putting your map together. So now what are you supposed to do with the information that you've got? So we're going to talk about that in the beginning of your literature review. So at this point, we're talking about step 4, analyzing the intertextual connections to form your literature review, which will involve synthesizing all of the sources that you found up to this point. Now, you'll remember that we talked about the Burkean parlor in our first lecture, which again was the metaphor created by Kenneth Burke in order to demonstrate what scholarship was like. And it demonstrates this idea that you come into a room where other people have been milling about and talking, and you listen to what they're saying because nobody can explain to you everything that's gone on. And then once you feel comfortable, you start participating in the discussion. So this is a reminder of what the parlor is, because what you're going to do now is to imagine that you have come into this parlor, you've been there a while, you've been listening, and then you have to explain to the person who comes in after you a summary of what's been going on, what people have been talking about, what's relevant to current issues. And this becomes the basis of what your literature review will be. And again, you can't explain everything because there's been quite a lot in any conversation, any academic conversation, but you want to explain the things that are going to be relevant to your particular project. So before you get started kind of summarizing, you want to think about a couple of questions. First, does your research show connections? If you're looking at your map and your matrix and you see no connections at all, then that's a problem. That may not be an issue for anybody, and I hope it's not, but if you don't show any connections, then you'll want to start looking back over your research or maybe doing some additional research. Second, is your research sufficient? That may have something to do with the fact that it's not connecting. It also may have something to do with the fact that you don't have enough support for particular parts of your lit review. So maybe you don't have enough research for the cause, or you don't have enough research to support the solution that you want to use. So you want to think about that because it may require you to go back and do some additional research, even though you found 10 articles already. So again, with the last question, you want to make sure that all of the research that you have is enough to support your project. So will it help you give evidence that there is actually a problem, and will it help you support the intervention that you choose for this particular problem? So now that you're ready to begin analyzing your research, you want to think about 3 things that are required for a literature review. The first is that you need to summarize the source information that you've got. The second part is that you need to synthesize that information. So you need to make connections between the articles and essentially summarize the conversation that's been happening in that Burkean parlor. The third is that you need to make connections to your own project. You need to explain why the research that you found is actually relevant to your particular project. And essentially what you're doing here is setting up the foundation for your own entry into the conversation. What this week's activity will also help you do is begin the pre-writing for your literature review. You'll start your summarizing, and that's going to be one of the discussion board things that your guys are asked to do this week. And that's going to be the beginning of what will ultimately be your lit review. So another thing that I want you to keep in mind is to remember that you have the image maps, and that this will provide you kind of a guideline for what you need to create as your summaries. So use the matrix and the maps to guide what you create. This is essentially the conversation that you have to explain. So keep looking back at this and making sure that you're covering all of the connections and all of the colors that you need to. The maps will also help you to identify particular causes and solutions that you need to discuss, to prioritize your information, meaning that you need to determine which causes and solutions are the most important that you cover and in what kind of depth. These maps will also help you to identify gaps in the conversation, topics that aren't researched or are missing entirely. These are places that you might contribute during your own project. The maps will also help you to determine if you need to do any additional research like we discussed before. So if your map is disconnected, if you see no connections, that's a sign that more research is needed. And if you don't see the solutions that you think are important or solutions that might be related to what you think are important, that's also a sign that you might need to do more research. So our example problem that I'm going to continue to use to illustrate what we're talking about here is, again, those 6th grade students having difficulty with reading comprehension. So I'm going to use that to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about in the next few slides. So the idea here is to put the pieces together. The first thing that you're going to want to think about is supporting the problem. We didn't talk about this in terms of the matrix and the map, but ultimately what you're going to need to do is prove that there is a problem here, that it's not just a problem in your particular school, in your city, in your state, that it is a problem throughout the state, throughout the country, and that other people have experienced this. So you will not want to find some kind of a research, and it's going to be in the articles that you already have, that this is in fact a problem. So use the research as a backup to indicate that. It also might be worth looking at to see if you find any articles that say that it's not a problem, that say that reading, 6th graders don't have problems with reading. In this case, it could, whatever would be the opposite of your particular project. And the reason why this could be useful is because you can argue against it. You can argue against it and say that this author says it's not a problem, however, I've got a lot of research that argues that it is. So it gives you another element of your conversation so that you're not just representing the part that supports your project, but you're also talking about people who might disagree and why you disagree with them. So consider adding that if you haven't already found some research to indicate that. So again, the point of this section is to provide that evidence that there is a problem. And in this case, I've provided a bit of an example to show you how you might phrase this. So this problem involves elements including recalling content, paraphrasing, and understanding the context. So in this case, I've indicated what the elements of the problem are, and then I'm going to cite authors who mention those elements to provide the support that I need. Then I might go into detail about each of those elements. So recalling content involves, and then I might explain what's involved in that and cite a particular author for that. Then I might go on to paraphrasing. What does that involve? Why are students having problems with that? And how does that contribute to problems reading? And then cite those sources. So think about doing something like that in order to justify your problem. The next step is to look at the causes and solutions of the problem. And you're essentially going to do the same thing for both the causes and the solutions. And I'm going to show you a kind of an example of what I mean here in a minute. But essentially what you need to do is summarize again the main points for each cause and each solution that you decide to discuss. The next thing that you want to do is then discuss the connections among the research based on those. So are there authors that agree together on the same cause? Are there authors who say that that's not a cause of the problem, and why? Does one author directly address another author and say that that author is incorrect or that that author is correct? Those might be things that you want to mention during your discussion of the conversation. The points of these sections are to justify the cause that you will ultimately identify as being the problem, being related to the problem, and then the solution that you ultimately choose to enact in your own classrooms. You're setting up the groundwork and the foundation that you need in order to enter that conversation. So you want to do a good job and give us a complete picture so that your reader will have an understanding of that before you start talking about your own information and your own approach to the problem. So again, these were the causes of the problem that we identified for our example. So there were 5 of them. Not enough time spent with material, no prior knowledge of material, unfamiliarity with active reading strategies, difficulty understanding context, and then retaining content. And numerous authors were involved here. Now, it may be that ultimately I decide that number 5 isn't that important because only one person talked about it, and I would like to focus more on the other 4. In that case, I don't have to talk about 5. I can just talk about the 4, summarize the main points, because these seem to be the ones that are dominating the conversation. So I would want to summarize each of these authors and then make the connections between them. So I would want to say that Burden, Davidson, and Crowley all agree that not enough time spent with material is one of the primary causes of the problem that we've identified. And I would do that, I would go into more explanation about what each author says about that. And then I would do that for all of the causes for that particular section of my paper. And I'll show you kind of what I mean as an example paragraph of something that I might come up with. This is a bit more formal than maybe the summaries that you're going to be required to submit for the discussion board this week, but it is the kind of thing that you'll want to start putting together for your paper. And we are going to talk about that more in the next couple of class periods. But in this case, it gives you an idea of how to introduce these different authors and make the connections. So one suggested cause of the problem is a lack of active reading strategy instruction at the elementary grade levels. So I'm identifying my first cause that I'm going to talk about. Burke et al. Argues that, and then I would go into detail about what Burke says about the cause. Then I might switch and say that Jones also connects a lack of active reading strategy to poor reading comprehension. So I've made a connection between Burke and Jones. She contends that, so then I go into more detail. Anderson adds to that analysis, so again, I'm making another connection by suggesting that, and then summarizing that these authors all point out that this is one of the primary causes of the problem. Next, in order to transition to my next cause, I might say that while lack of active reading strategy is gaining momentum as an identified cause of the problem, other scholarship has identified blank. And then I might go into my second cause and talk about the authors that agree with that cause. So Ortlieb argues that while Peterson agrees with Ortlieb on one particular thing, she places greater emphasis on blank. So she might be focusing on a different aspect of that cause. So again, you want to make these connections while summarizing the information that's in the particular articles. So this again is just an example, and it might be a little more formal than you need for your discussion board, but this is kind of where you want to go with it for your paper. So this week, as I said, you guys will be working on summarizing and analyzing the connections that you found and doing that on the discussion board. To give you an idea of what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks and to give you a little context about the lit review itself, ultimately, after you finish this week, we're going to start taking the pre-writing that you've done and applying that into writing your actual literature review. So that will be the next step. This is an overview of what an outline of your literature review might look like. This is not the only way to organize this, but it does give you a place to start. So you can see that the first thing that you'd want to talk about is providing support or evidence for your problem, that it actually exists outside of your particular school. The next thing you might do is talk about the causes of the problem, and you'd summarize each article for each cause, and then synthesize that information, make those connections. Then you would transition into the solutions. So you want to provide us some kind of a transition to let us know we're going from causes to solutions, and then again, summarize each article, synthesize that information. And then you would want to transition into your action or intervention. And in this case, what you're going to do is identify the cause that you ultimately agree with as being a part of this problem. It could be more than one cause, and you would be referencing back to the information that you already summarized earlier in the literature review. Same thing with the solution. You might refer back to the solutions that you've already discussed, but you want to identify what you have decided is the solution to the problem. While your solution may not be exactly what other articles suggest, you do want to show that there is some kind of support that your intervention will actually be successful. So you want to kind of piece together things in those articles to show that you have evidence that this will work. So think about this outline, this context as you're working on these summaries, because you're going to fit these into this outline ultimately. That's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, I'll be on the Google Hangout tomorrow night with Dr. Pettit. And as always, you can email me or come into the GSSC, and I'm happy to help you guys out. Thanks.